Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Lauren Auer. Lauren is a licensed clinical professional counselor and trauma therapist with a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Regent University and dual bachelor's degrees in sociology and criminal justice from Bradley University. She holds extensive professional certifications and is trained in EMDR, brain spotting, internal family systems, and psychedelic assisted therapy. She specializes in trauma recovery, attachment wounds, and nervous system healing, helping people break free from survival mode and step into true self awareness and emotional safety. Beyond her clinical work, Lauren is deeply passionate about mental health education and advocacy. And through her platform, she shares transformational insights on trauma healing, self trust, and emotional regulation, making therapy more approachable and accessible. Lauren's work is not just about treatment, it's about transformation. And she believes healing isn't just about coping with the past, but about reclaiming your future with strength, self compassion, and a renewed sense of possibility. Whether through therapy, education, or advocacy, Lauren is redefining what it means to heal, helping people move from merely surviving to truly thriving. So, Lauren, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I got a little tongue twisted there. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Yeah.
Also, I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm located in central Illinois, kind of born and raised here in the Midwest, middle of nowhere country. And yeah, I started my own practice in 2020, but before that, I knew for a long time that I wanted to be a therapist. I think a lot of it kind of felt ingrained in my personality. I'm a really curious person and definitely just I see every side of things when people are in conflict or whatever, and it's just really interesting to me. And also, my grandfather was a therapist, so I was pretty familiar with the field. And so, I tried straying from that path a few times. When I entered into undergrad, I decided I didn't want to take on that much student loans. Therapy, being a therapist, got to go to school for a long time. And so I switched my path to criminal justice at that time. My mom works in the criminal justice field, and I felt like, oh, it's kind of like therapy in a different way. And it was interesting to me. So I kind of ended up going down that path, but ended up doing an internship at the juvenile detention center when I was in undergrad. And it was just so clear to me and nagging at me that those kids that were in there had a lot of trauma that was really not being addressed. And there was something in my core that could not get over that. And I knew that if I didn't go back to the path I had originally intended to follow, that it was going to nag at me forever. And so I did. I ended up, switching back into clinical mental health counseling. And then from there, kind of, just landing in environments unintentionally where trauma was at the core of it. And so I, got a really good idea of what that looked like in so many different contexts. And that's kind of what led me to opening my own practice. It just became this huge passion that I'm just so fascinated with. And I absolutely love it.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
And it seems like it's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
Um, what I wanted to ask is about your early life and your
Mhm.
childhood. Was
Mhm.
was mental health something that was openly discussed in your family, or were there moments in childhood where you felt the weight of trauma?
Mm.
Whether you knew what trauma was at that point or not, whether it was yours or someone else's?
Yeah, well, like I said before, my grandfather was a therapist, so I would say, like, the topic of mental health didn't have a lot of stigma around it in my family, but it was something that growing up, I almost feel like didn't apply to me.
Mhm,
um, and I guess the way that I experienced my upbringing was there was a lot of chaos around me in my household. I mean, each of my parents are on their third marriage. I have a lot of step siblings and half siblings, and a lot of change that was pretty constant. A lot of turmoil around all of that. And I was kind of the kid that, quote, they didn't have to worry about. It was kind of like everybody else had a lot of needs and had a lot of external mental health, behavioral, emotional things going on. And I really threw myself into like academics and sports and clubs and achieving and working. And the minute I turned 15, which was the age in Illinois at the time anyway, that you can like legally get a job, I was like out there filling out job applications. I just wanted to do, and kind of ended up focusing so much on the things that I could control, which was that. And that was my way of coping with it. I didn't realize that at the time. I realize that now doing the work that I do. But yeah, I didn't, I think the way that I was treated by the adults in my life and the other people in my life, they looked at me kind of like, wow, you really have your stuff together. You're really, resilient and doing so well. And I really believed that and thought that was true until I got really into doing this work. And then it was kind of this like backwards realization of like, oh, I do,
mhm,
I do have trauma that I've literally never faced. I've just been, you know, filling my head and my life and my schedule with so much stuff so I don't have to actually feel those feelings. And so that's kind of been my process there. Is I don't think it was until adulthood that I was able to actually label anything as traumatic for me. And so, um, yeah, it was kind of a different situation than a lot of the things that I think we think of when we think of trauma, but just as valid and just as difficult. In some cases, maybe more. Just it depends on the situation. But yeah.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It was deeply personal, and I have a lot of experience and have seen a lot where the kid who doesn't have any needs,
Hmm.
because they don't express themselves or they don't ask for things, they learn to internalize everything and to be the good kid by
Hmm.
not being the squeaky wheel or what have you. And that is anxiety inducing because
Yeah.
you never get your needs met. You learn not to have needs.
Right.
And then, that starts to develop as symptoms in your body.
Mhm.
When did you, I guess, realize what anxiety was? And when did you start to feel it in your body based off of your early experiences?
Mm. Yeah, I feel like, you know, in doing graduate work and working with um, different ages and populations of people that had been traumatized, there was a lot of situations in which I was like sitting across from, a little girl doing therapy with her that reminded me so much of myself. Um, and seeing, some of those similarities of I remember one time I was there, I had a job where I would go out into the schools to see kids for therapy, to kind of break down the transportation barriers and stuff with parents not having to schedule and bring them in. And I was seeing this little girl at this grade school, and her family was in complete chaos at the time. It was a really hard situation, but I was signing into the office and I asked for the office staff to call that girl down there to meet with me, and the principal overheard me asking for her and kind of chimed in and said, "Why are you here for so and so? You know, she's like one of our brightest students. Like she doesn't need therapy." And what I obviously I wasn't going to share information, confidentiality. I didn't,
Sure.
give a lot of information, but it was, it was through situations like that where I was kind of looking in a mirror almost at, no, like I know that this girl is really struggling, and this is how she's presenting, is that she's a star student and really bright and all of these things. And I'm seeing her inner world because she had developed that trust with me and was letting me in. And so I think a lot of those little kind of building blocks of situations around that is what really helped me to be like, okay, I need to face some stuff too. Like I didn't have a me coming to my school to talk to me about stuff when I was that age. And so it's never too late to do that work. It's not like, oh, well, it's done now and here I am. Like, no, it was still impacting me. And being able to realize the ways in which that did impact me and seeing how that showed up in my life, at work, outside of work, in my family, all that kind of stuff. Um, it was kind of unavoidable at that point.
Mhm. I love the fact that you are having that self-reflection in others because, I mean, you do get a chance to almost reparent yourself,
Yeah.
um, and you're providing something for someone who, needs it, and you're doing it in a way to where, like, because you didn't have it, you can see the need and you can show up for them in a way that does something for you and them,
Yeah.
and I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely, you know, made me kind of shift into really needing to put my own growth and healing primary so that I could continue to do that work. And um, it was a hard process, but I'm so glad that I had that opportunity to do that. That's the path I went on. I have no idea how it would have looked had I not had those experiences, but definitely eye opening and very validating for the things that I had been through.
Sure. And it's funny because when people have like a chaotic upbringing
Hmm.
and they, quote unquote make it where they have everything together and they got out, a lot of times having to survive in a way to where you don't have any of your needs met and you don't have any support system and you make it, it can look like you are successful.
Hmm.
And, on paper you can be successful, but what happens when things start to slow down and like you have to face what you've been avoiding?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think I saw so much of that during like the COVID lockdowns that I think that forced slowdown for so
Mm,
many people was kind of that straw that broke the camel's back of, now they can't go anywhere. They can't distract as much. They can't,
mhm.
all of these things, or it was bringing out fears or family dynamics or whatever conflicts that it kind of, in some ways, I think forced a lot of people to have no choice but to look at that stuff. And of course, as terrible as that time was, I do think that there was a really big impact on the mental health field and um, the stigma around mental health, and a lot of even access to mental health services with so many things going virtual, things that y- I think it was during that time. That's the time that I got trained in EMDR, and it was the first time that they started offering that training virtually. Because before then, it was thought like you can't really do this virtually. It's not effective. And so it forced a lot of us to shift our perspective on how we offer these things and how to make it accessible for more people. So if there's anything that's good that came out of that time, I definitely think that that was something that was significant for a lot of people.
Mm. I see. And you talked about that slowdown
Mhm.
and having to, I guess, acknowledge what's going on in your inner world or acknowledge what things you've been avoiding, whether you've known it or you only realize it once you slow down. And that moment is often quiet. It's sometimes earth shattering, and we realize that we are carrying pain and that
Mm.
maybe it's not ours.
Yeah.
And in that moment, we can take that pain and turn it into a purpose.
Mhm.
Was there a point in your life when you felt that shift where you went from surviving your own experiences to knowing that you were meant to help others too?
Yeah, I for me, I feel like it was I don't know. I kind of when I look back at all of these significant points in my life, it feels like it wasn't like one major moment shift as much as it was a bunch of little moments that shifted that. And I think that I don't know, for me, it was like I said, it was a little bit backwards. It wasn't like I knew I had all this stuff that I needed to work on and worked on and then decided to put all that energy into then helping other people. It was more like I started with helping other people and that made me realize, how much of my own stuff I did have that I hadn't been giving the energy that it needed. Um but yeah, I mean, I think a big one for me when I was in my undergrad program interning at the juvenile detention center, um, and like really understanding trauma and like seeing that trauma. There was incident, and the incidents happened all the time there, but it was a day kids were eating lunch or something in the cafeteria and a fight broke out. Fist fight just kind of out of nowhere and chaos, and there's a whole protocol about what we're supposed to do when those things happened, get the other kids out of the room, deal with the people that were fighting. Um, and there was one kid that when the fight broke out, he just like went into this collapse mode at the table and just, had his hands over his head and was just like total collapse, total freeze. And every other kid was doing what they were supposed to. They knew they had to get up, they had to, leave the cafeteria. That was what was required of them. And that kid that was in that collapse mode, the staff was really upset with him, yelling at him and treating it like he was being defiant. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. Um, and they kept getting like louder and more upset with him, like, get up, like he was doing something wrong by just what they, I think, saw as him refusing to move. But I just saw that collapse and how them escalating towards him was just like making it worse and worse and worse. And it was just so eye-opening to me to see, like, we don't know enough about this, we're actually adding harm on top of harm, and I don't know what that kid's story was, I have no idea what his history was, anything like that, but it was clear to me that he was in a trauma response that was complete shutdown, and he wasn't choosing that as much as it was just his body going into that mode. And so, like, instances like that kept happening in different environments, and I was seeing this trauma show up for people in all these different ways, and um it just caused me to want to, you know be that voice, be that person that says, "Hey, let's look at it this way," or maybe it's that, instead of just automatically assuming things about the situation, but actually looking through a trauma lens.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing that example. And
Yeah.
I mean, to be a child, and obviously he had some sort of trauma history because his nervous system was responding to overwhelm,
Yeah.
and to not have anyone know what's happening and you just get bombarded with more and more pressure that, could send your body into that collapsed state. I mean, that does show that we do need more education, more training, especially in the school systems, because
Mhm.
early life and childhood is when our nervous systems are shaped.
Right.
So I'm glad that you were in that facility and there are others like you trying to help juveniles because they need it. They're the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We've mentioned trauma a lot, and what I want to do is kind of get a baseline of what trauma is. So, in your professional opinion and based on your experience, how would you define trauma?
Mm. Oh, that's the $1,000,000 question. Yeah, I've yet to find a definition of trauma that I'm like, that encompasses it. That's it right there, you know? Um, I've been trying to work on something for like to figure out how to conceptualize it, but I think for me, the biggest thing when I think about trauma and that I want people to understand with trauma, because I think it can be such a like a buzzword. It's almost, I feel like, lost some of its meaning because of how much it's thrown around. Um, and we have so many preconceived ideas of what that is. But the most important thing to me is that it's not really about having a definition for it as much as it's how the individual person experiences a situation, right? Just like that cafeteria situation, you know, um, there were kids that it was like, oh, another fight, whatever, went on with their day. Like they weren't even phased by the situation, right? But that kid experiencing the same exact thing in the same exact setting went into a full trauma response. And so I think it's so important to keep in mind how it's more about how our nervous system, how our body experiences an event and what our nervous system defines as trauma for itself rather than, witnessing a fight in a public setting is traumatic. Okay, well, for some people, yes. And for some people, not at all. Right. Um, and so I think that that's a big thing that I think it's important for people to really remember when it comes to that and not discount their own experiences or others' experiences if it seems like, well, that doesn't seem that traumatizing, um, because it doesn't really matter what our logical mind puts meaning to. Um, but also, I think that it's anything that we're either enduring something that is unpleasant for prolonged periods of time or it's too much all at once, but it's also the lack of something like neglect, like not having what you need for too long a period of time. Like those things can all be very traumatizing. And it just looks so different for so many different people and how they experience that.
I love that you said it's how your body defines what is happening because if
Mhm.
we just say trauma is this, then we have to go by that. So if it doesn't align with your nervous system's response, then you could feel like, okay, well, I don't have any trauma.
Right.
But if we say, okay, this is trauma and how you experience it and how your body defines it is what trauma is for you, that makes it personal.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, so trauma responses
Hmm.
like shutdown and things of that nature are some obvious ones, but then there's things like people pleasing and self sabotage,
Hmm.
um, which are survival mechanisms that we can learn in childhood. Have you seen these patterns play out in adults who have unresolved trauma?
Oh, yeah. Myself included.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it's important for people to understand like people pleasing and self sabotage, like any trauma response, like it's not a character flaw, but it's an adaptation of something that kept them safe. So when I'm working with like adults carrying unresolved trauma, those patterns show up so much, and it's because the nervous system doesn't distinguish between like past threats and present threats. That's hard to say.
Mhm.
So if a current situation is echoing something, even if it's subtle, even if they're not aware this is echoing something, the body is, responding before the mind even gets there. um the people pleaser, that's not just a nice person. They're perpetually scanning for safety by making themselves valuable enough to keep around, or the self saboteur isn't lazy. Maybe they're protecting themselves from the vulnerability of success, that once made them a target, right? And so there's all these different things that are under these behaviors that have a real purpose. um, and the thing that they have in common is that they made sense in the environment that they developed in. So if a child like learned to anticipate like a hostile parent's needs before they exploded, and then became the person that can like read a room really well and can tell whenever somebody is struggling or uncomfortable or is like really in touch with the mood of the room, um, that is something that could have developed out of the environment in which they were raised in, right? So a lot of this work is helping people kind of recognize those patterns, and not as failures, but as a testament to like their actual resilience and the strategies that protected them, and be able to add some space in there and get curious enough about when those things come up to see if they actually need that response in the current moment, or if it's because of old stuff that is coming up in their system that still needs to be released and processed through.
Mm.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful explanation, and I think it'll do a lot for people who may be experiencing these things because a lot of times they happen without us even having any cognition
Right.
or understanding of what's happening because it's the body doing what the body does.
Right.
And like you said, scanning the room and learning how to, I guess, beat a parent to their behavior because you know what'll happen because of it. So if you respond early, you protect yourself from that.
Yeah.
Um, and that could do a lot of damage to the nervous system because, like you said, you're in a constant state of what word am I trying to think of heightened anxiety,
Yeah.
or your nervous system is in fight or flight
Mhm.
constantly. And so as you learn these things, you get to a point where you want to, I guess, make changes, and a big part of making those changes to protect yourself is setting boundaries.
Mhm.
And boundaries is a hot topic right now. Everybody's talking about it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And going no contact and cutting people out of your life completely. And that may not always be what's necessary. Sometimes it may
Right.
be, but I think if you set a boundary and the boundary is respected, then you learn how to give people a window of where you operate from, and that can be very healthy for the
Yeah.
relationship and for you as well.
Mhm.
But when there are times where you need to set like a hard or a strong boundary and it causes there to be some separation and disconnect in relationships, if you still love and care about the person,
Mhm.
even though they may sometimes hurt you, is it possible to let someone know what's not okay without losing them or feeling guilty about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, boundaries is kind of taken on this strange weight in our culture. Like drawing these hard lines or erasing somebody on the other side of that line, but they're really not supposed to be walls as much as the intended use of them, hopefully, is to be more of a bridge that allows you to remain connected while still honoring your own needs. Um, like it's not something we're doing against another person as much as it's something that we're doing for ourselves and ultimately for the relationship. Sometimes that does mean having no contact. Um, But ideally, it's a way to, you know, exist with a person, be in relationship in some level with a person in a way that feels healthy to both of you. Um, so yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't love someone or you're cutting it off. It actually is just like creating conditions where authentic connection can happen. So if you don't have those boundaries, sometimes resentment builds, and that is what is destroying the relationship, right? Like if, let's say, I don't know, a parent is calling you a lot and is always wanting to like vent about their day or whatever, and it's really causing this pent up annoyance and resentment. And every time you see their name pop up on your phone, you're just like, oh gosh, again, like you're having this resentment towards this person. And if you want to have a healthy and pleasant and loving relationship with them, but you continue to not have boundaries in place, like that's a very hard thing to do, right? And so being able to find ways to set those boundaries, and I also say like sometimes it is a conversation, sometimes it is a hey, I'm getting really overwhelmed with other things in my life. I need to really kind of limit how much time I spend on the phone. It can be a conversation, right? But I think there are also situations in which it's not even like a direct conversation that needs to happen as much as it's just how you operate with that person. Sometimes people don't have the emotional maturity themselves to be in a conversation like that. So maybe that looks like, you know, not answering the phone as often. Maybe that means you call them a few times a week on your 10-minute drive home when you know there's a set amount of time that you have to talk, and it's a natural end to the conversation. When you're pulling into the garage, you say, all right, I gotta get in the house, I got some stuff to do, but it was good talking to you, where those boundaries are just how you are interacting and like living your life with that person. Whereas if you're choosing to drive 10 minutes home on the phone with them and then sit in the garage on the phone, or go into the house and be moving about your stuff while you're still on the phone with them for another hour, like that is actually like a choice that you're making, that you don't have boundaries with yourself, right? When it comes to that. And so it's not selfish. It's really the foundation of genuine relationships.
Hmm. Um, I've often heard of boundaries referred to as self-protection,
Mhm.
which, I mean, if you look at it like that, it can show that there's a need, especially if by not setting boundaries, you're hurting yourself. And it could be a form of self-sabotage too.
Right.
So I wanted to ask, how can someone tell if they are coping instead of doing their best to set a boundary, and by
Mhm.
coping, avoiding conflict, over explaining, or staying small, and that's keeping them stuck?
Yeah. Yeah. It can be a fine line, I think, for sure. But the way that I think about it is like self protection serves your growth and self sabotage keeps you small. So the difference is not really in the behavior itself, but more so in the aftermath. So after like true self protection, there's usually a sense of relief and expansion. But after self sabotage, which could be disguised as self protection, you might feel shame or regret or a nagging feeling of having like missed something important. And so I think a lot of it is focusing on what those feelings are for you and in your body after certain interactions, and being able to ask yourself, is this choice moving me towards or away from the person that I want to become? Because avoiding conflict might protect you from immediate discomfort, but it doesn't protect your long term well being. And over explaining might feel safer in that moment, but if it leaves you feeling like disempowered, then is it really for your better good? Is it really moving you towards the person that you want to be? And our bodies hold so much wisdom here. Like our bodies
Mm.
will tell us what we're feeling. So if you're caught in trying to figure out that distinction, um, all you have to really do is just like notice what's going on in your body. Is your chest tight? Are your shoulders by your ears? Are you breathing differently? Are there physical signs there? Because those often reveal when you're operating from those old protective patterns rather than the present needs at hand. So oftentimes you might not know till afterwards, and that's okay. But if you are taking that time to be curious afterwards, that's going to help you discern that a lot more.
Mm. And our
Mhm.
bodies are so wise if we could just listen to the
Yeah.
messages. But, we've been trained not to trust ourselves, to disconnect from our power. Um, and that could cause a lot of anxiety. And if we're constantly anxious, we won't be able to get those messages.
Right.
And, a lot of people have symptoms of anxiety like racing thoughts and feeling on edge,
Mhm.
or just not knowing who they are. And
Mhm.
a lot of times it's because their nervous systems are just stuck.
Mhm.
And can we talk about that a little bit? Can you break down what's really happening inside someone's body when they're
Sure.
in a constant state of anxiety and
Yeah.
overthinking and unable to relax?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, your nervous system is constantly perceiving everything. So, you know, like I have a fork on my desk and I could tell you in as much detail as I can possibly muster everything I can think of. It's silver, it's kind of dirty, I need to wash it, it has 4 prongs, whatever. But like my nervous system could give you like 100,000 times more information on that fork. Like it's constantly perceiving everything around us at a much, much deeper level. So when your nervous system is perceiving a threat, so for instance, like it might be something subtle, like a tone of voice, right? Your automatic nervous system is going to activate, and when that happens, your brain diverts blood flow away from your prefrontal cortex, which is like that rational thinking part of the brain. Um, and it's going to go right into that survival system, and that's where your heart rate's going to increase. Your breathing might become shallow. Maybe your muscles tense. Whatever your own personal physiology is going to do, that's going to override anything that feels logical or that you can tell a story about. And so when you're in that state, um, things like overthinking becomes kind of like a habit. It's your brain's way of trying to control the outcome because that feels like a way to feel safe. Um, so things like people pleasing, it's not weakness, it's actually a survival response to avoid rejection. So if you're hearing a tone of voice that reminds you of a critical parent, for instance, whether you're consciously in that moment going, this tone of voice reminds me of my critical parent, maybe you have that insight, or a lot of times you don't. It's just this automatic thing that comes up, right? Um, and then you might notice yourself feeling more on edge or um, trying to soften the conversation or something. And it's those automatic things that are happening. And a lot of us, unfortunately, kind of live in that state without realizing that we're in that state or that there's another way to exist because our bodies get so accustomed to that heightened state that we mistake it for normal. And so we think anxiety is our baseline because maybe we've never really experienced what true regulation feels like. So, the good thing is, though, that your nervous system is designed to return to regulation with the right tools. Um, so, like little shifts and little, like intentional things that you can do is really helping your body do what it's actually designed to do. And you can teach it that safety looks different now than times when it wasn't safe.
So what if someone has never had a baseline of safety? Their baseline has just been anxiety and chaos and go, 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 and just in a constant state of fight or flight. And they start to
Mhm.
feel safety and it feels uncomfortable
Mhm.
or it feels off. How do you manage that? Like helping someone to find safety in safety.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I see that a lot, and I think That's something that often surprises people when they're going through a healing process of, let's say they've had a lot of terrible, chaotic, or abusive relationships, and now they're in a healthy relationship, and their logical prefrontal cortex is going, I should feel happy and this should feel good and I should feel relaxed. But what their body is doing is sending in like alarms because it doesn't feel normal. It feels off, right? And so that's definitely a thing. And having that self awareness is really important. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think that number one, like normalizing that so that people understand, like, that's actually a thing that sometimes when you are healing or making positive change or getting more in tune with your body, processing through things, that it might actually feel more activating. And I think sometimes that's when people intentionally or unintentionally self sabotage because that at least feels familiar, right? Like it's at least familiar is known. And so it almost feels like they're in more control if they can get ahead of the situation. Or they have this feeling of, well, this is good, but like, when's the other shoe going to drop? Because their system has always been in that mode that they feel like, well, this can't last. Or there's something flawed about me that, I don't deserve this, or whatever it is, the cognition's going on behind that. It's a very normal part of the healing process, and recognizing that just because it feels that way in the moment, you're not stuck there. Again, you can learn and do things little by little that helps, change those pathways that are stored in your brain that are saying, oh, this feels different and this feels out of the norm, right? But over time, when there's, small movements towards that feeling is going to be less and less, and you're going to learn to trust it more. And you still need that part of you that is, aware of potential danger or whatever, because at the end of the day, like, we don't know what's going to happen, and you don't want to shut that part of yourself off, because that does have an important purpose in your life. So it's being able to hold those things together.
So, how would you get to a point where you recognize a part that has maybe been keeping you in survival mode, but now it's kind of sabotaging your joy and happiness
Mhm.
because you're in an unfamiliar space? Like, if safety is unfamiliar and your body is, I guess, trying to choose what's normal,
Mhm.
and you feel that and you go, oh my goodness, this part of me is just so bad. I wish I didn't have this part. Like, is there a way to recognize that it's not a bad part of you and to see it with compassion, and I guess kind of give it a new job and help it integrate into the system that's healing?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, trauma is primarily stored, in the parts of our brain and our body and our nervous system, where it's subcortical. It's not a lot of like logic or fact or being able to tell a story. So, um, you can have all the insight in the world, maybe about like why you panic during a conflict or shut down when you're criticized. But if your body is still carrying the imprint of that threat, intellectual understanding won't really create that change. And so it is important to have that intellectual understanding. Um, but that's really where that somatic piece becomes really essential. Somatic means bringing the full body into that process. Talking is good because it can help you make meaning. But if you're not bringing in the body, then you can't really address where that trauma is actually held. And so being able to identify it is one thing, but being able to feel it is a different thing. And so being able to identify, okay, I can identify that this part is coming up. I can logically explain it I've seen people in therapy so many times that have maybe done a lot of therapy or done a lot of self-help and done all the things. And they're like, I can tell you exactly why I do this, why it makes sense. It goes back to this thing in my childhood and was reinforced by that thing or whatever. But when I'm in whatever the situation is, I still get really anxious, right? It's like, so I know why it is, but it's not making it stop. And if you think of it in the way of like, if you're riding a bicycle for the first time, no amount of reading about balance or how the mechanics of bicycles work is going to just like make you a pro bicycle rider, right? Your body actually needs the actual experience of finding, what does that balance actually feel like and what do those movements feel like? Similarly, your nervous system needs experiences of safety and regulation and not just concepts. So, your awareness is step one, but until you're actually like slowing down and noticing these things in your body or even putting yourself in situations like I mentioned earlier about, having a bunch of really toxic bad relationships and then being in a good relationship, you know, it's like almost like allowing yourself some of that discomfort of being in something new and it feeling safe or somebody being authentic with you and not having an ulterior motive, being in that over time and being really in tune with what your body feels like, that is what's going to create that safety over time. But it is a slow process and it's supposed to be a slow process. We say a lot in like this trauma world, like fast is slow and slow is fast. People want to like figure it out. They want to get to the end of it, but that's not how it works. Kind of like if I went to the gym for the first time in years, I'm not going to be able to like pick up the most heavy weights and do everything in perfect form. Like I would have to build up to that. It's exactly the same when it comes to healing.
Mm. Thank you so much for explaining that the way you did. And I guess that is where other modalities would come in aside from just talk therapy. And you work with EMDR, brain spotting, internal family systems, and
Hmm.
even ketamine.
Hmm.
And to some, they may seem a little unconventional or intimidating. But in your experience working with these modalities, what's the biggest misconception people have about healing, and what's the hard truth that many don't want to hear?
Yeah. I think the there's a lot of misconceptions, but like the nature of healing itself, like many people, they come into therapy expecting like transformation without a lot of that discomfort or again like the pace. They want to heal those childhood wounds without feeling the grief they've been outrunning, or they want to change relationship patterns without the vulnerability of doing relationships differently. And so healing really requires us to feel again in our body what we've been avoiding. um the numbing, the perfectionism, the control, like they all protected us for a good reason, but moving beyond them means experiencing the emotions they've been really keeping at bay. So I think of clients who come for help with anxiety and they get frustrated when we start addressing like childhood experiences, right? Like I thought we are working on my anxiety, not digging at my past, but really like what they end up discovering is that anxiety isn't actually the problem. It's their body's solution to keeping painful emotions contained. And as they safely process those emotions, the anxiety is going to naturally subside over time. And so the irony is that while healing requires actually facing the pain, it's ultimately less painful than continuing to outrun themselves. And the energy it takes to suppress that is absolutely exhausting. So, in terms of therapy and like all the modalities that are out there, um, you know, I really gravitate towards those things like EMDR and brain spotting and, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, all those things, because ultimately what all of those modalities are doing is it's activating those deeper parts of our brain and our nervous system, and it's bringing the full body into the therapy room. It's getting past just like the talk therapy, that prefrontal cortex where people find themselves getting stuck. And it's really like that is the process that they can find that healing and like move through those actual like deeper rooted things.
Mm. Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
Another modality that you are well versed in is internal family systems.
Mhm.
And I love IFS. It was life changing for me. Can you talk a little bit about what IFS is and how you incorporate it in your practice?
Yeah, I love IFS. It's so I don't know. I feel like it's almost hard for me to describe what IFS is not because now that I'm so familiar with it, I like can't unsee everything through that lens. Um, but basically what it is, and I'm sure you've, talked about this at times on your podcast, but in the same way that, like, if I were seeing a family for therapy and one person thinks this is the best and the other person thinks this is the best, and this person just kind of shuts down, and, there's all these different dynamics in these families, we're bringing it internal, that we, as a singular person, have these parts of ourselves like, well, part of me feels bad, but the other part of me feels really relieved, and in the same way that a family system has different ways of looking at things and feeling like this is what's best for the person, this is what's going to keep them safe. No, no, that's not right. This is the best way. We do that to ourselves, right? And we often kind of battle with ourselves over these things, or we shame ourselves for the ways that we're dealing with it. And that really just kind of perpetuates the problem. And so being able to really slow it down and notice when something is coming up, like if it's a defense, um, like really getting curious about what is that defense doing? How is that trying to keep us safe? It's there for a reason, and ignoring it or shutting it down in the same way that if you had a parent feeling like coming at somebody over their kid, feeling really defensive on their behalf and trying to protect their kid and keep them safe, and everyone around them was shaming them or trying to get them to be quiet or shut up, that parent might get louder and get more intense and be like, no, this is serious. This is what's going to help. Shutting it down is going to make it louder a lot of the times. And so we're doing that often to ourselves. So being able to recognize how that is playing out within us and looking at it differently can be extremely freeing.
Mhm. I agree so much. And I
Yeah.
love the way you explained that. Thanks for doing that the way you did. So let's say someone's listening and they've heard everything you said and they get it, right? And they know they should slow down, try and regulate their nervous system, um, get back in their bodies and feel their feelings and do their inner
Mhm.
work, but they
Mhm.
don't. What would you say to someone who's afraid to heal because their pain is the only thing that they've ever known?
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, when your pain has been there and has always been there, letting it go can kind of feel like losing a part of your identity, right? Like if you're afraid to heal because it's all you've known, the first thing I would say is, you know, that pain has some wisdom, and being hesitant is really normal in that situation. It's not something weak about them. It's just that their system is recognizing that change, even positive change, is really uncertain. It's unknown. And uncertainty doesn't feel safe. And so if you start by getting more curious about that pain rather than immediately trying to release it, but like again, like separating, asking like, how has that pain protected me? What has it taught me? How has it served me? And honor those answers before asking that pain to step aside, and not focusing then on what you're losing, but rather getting more specific about what healing might give you. Um, Not vague concepts like happiness, but like tangible experiences, the ability to take a deep breath without your chest tightening, or the freedom to express a need without shame, or the joy that you get in being able to connect with people without feeling really hypervigilant. If you start to build those experiences of those new possibilities alongside that familiar pain, like having both of them in tandem rather than attempting to replace it all at once. Like your nervous system is actually needs evidence that safety is possible before it actually loosens its grip on those old protections. So it doesn't mean erasing your past or becoming unrecognizable as much as it means integrating all the parts of your story, including the pain, into a larger sense of self that has room for a lot more than just surviving. And it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be quick, but like that is the way through it.
Mm. Thank you so much for that. That was so beautifully expressed,
Thank you.
so eloquent in the way you did it too. Speaking of healing,
Mhm.
if you had to describe healing in just 3 words, what would it be?
Messy, sacred, impossible, and possible, not impossible. Yeah. I wouldn't do this work if it wasn't, you know. It's hard, it's messy, but it's really beautiful and it works, you know.
You're passionate about it, I think, is something that people can hear just in the way you, express yourself and what you do, the way you do it as well, so,
Mm.
um, with all the work that you're doing to help people, what is it that you want people to know most?
I think I would want anybody to know that, you're never too broken to heal. It's never too late to heal. Nothing is too small or too big to heal. So, the things that they've maybe been taught to see as their greatest weaknesses or their sensitivity, um, all of those things, they can become such huge strengths if you work with them rather than against them. And the way that they adapted, even the things that no longer serve them or are maybe causing harm in other ways now, but like the ways that they adapted is also beautiful and like got them to the point where they are now of being more open to healing. Um, and that, it doesn't happen all at once, but it happens in like those small moments. So, you know, you're already everybody I feel like is truly capable and already in some form or fashion on their way, even if it doesn't feel like it. And to just, you know, trust that process.
Mm. I think that the way you describe healing, and the space that you hold because of your own journey and because of your experience and because of everything that you know really sets people up, especially your clients and those that, maybe follow your platform on social media to be in a space where they can learn so much and really have an avenue to do the work and learn the work. So thank you for that. And what I want to ask is when it's all said and done, decades from now, when people think about you or when they hear your name, what do you hope they say?
I mean, really, like kind of what you just said, like that is my hope, truly, that I really hope that, people just can trust that I do my best to always be authentic, that I'm not going to pretend healing is simpler, or cleaner than it is. But I really do believe in everyone's capacity to heal, even if they don't believe it themselves or can't see themselves. Because ultimately this work, there's all cor- all kinds of, techniques and modalities and all these things out there, but it's really not about that as much as it's about um, bearing witness to suffering and resilience and holding space for all of it, even the messy stuff and even the hard stuff and what it means to be human. And I just hope that, as long as I do that with integrity, that's enough.
Mm. I think it will be enough. And I think that decades from now, when people look back at your work, what you wanted to accomplish, it will be done. So,
Mm.
all right, last question.
Okay.
If you could use your platform to educate anyone who may be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that it's about just starting wherever you're at and knowing your own capacity. So that looks different for different people. Different people have access to different things, different resources. Some people, you know, have health insurance benefits that can get them great therapy, and some people don't have access to that. And so um, I think it's about just like really just starting, even if it's a yeah, like an online support group or a mental health app or talking to a trusted person in your life, or just acknowledging to yourself like I'm not okay right now, and that's okay. I think even just like those small steps can really propel you forward. um you know Ultimately it's not about like finding like, oh, this is the type of therapy you need, this is the type of tools you need, as much as um, things like movement and connection and creativity and spirituality or whatever, like all of those things can be really powerful pathways to well-being. And the goal isn't really to become a different person. It's about really becoming more of yourself, um, with less interference from your pain and more capacity for joy. So whatever step that looks like, even if it's small, that's really significant in your healing journey doesn't need to really look like anybody else's in order to be valid. You really just need to begin. And, I think a lot of times that is the hardest step, but it doesn't have to be this like huge, profound step necessarily. It's just those small movements, and it's about like waking up and continuing to choose that.
Mhm. That was wonderful advice. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
Um, Thank you so much for all of this. Thank you for agreeing to do this with me, for
of
giving me your
course.
time. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for using your pain as a pathway for yourself and building a bridge for others to learn from your experiences. And I'm just really grateful to have had this opportunity to share space with you and allow you to share your knowledge.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. Obviously, I geek out over it. I get really excited about it, so I'm always happy to share whatever I have.
Where can people find you online and on social media?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I'm your trauma therapist underscore, and then TikTok, it's just your trauma therapist. And then I also have been really loving writing on my Substack newsletter lately, and that's also just your trauma therapist. And I try really hard to kind of like what I was just saying, not everybody has access to all these things, but hopefully the stuff I put out, I try really hard to make it understandable and also backed by research and stuff so that people can hopefully see it and be like, oh, that's normal for me to feel that way, or I didn't realize that was a thing, and that can be that, seed, hopefully, that gets people to start being more open to doing their own healing. So yeah, those are my main things. Also, my website is steadfastcounseling.com. But those are the main places people can find me.
All right, Lauren. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Thank you for letting your light shine in a way that allows others to know that theirs can shine as well. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Yeah, thank you.